What is gender identity, and is gender identity important? Gender identity is not just the name of the protected attribute of trans people in anti-discrimination legislation. It is also the name of a concept taken to be in competition with two other concepts, sex and gender, to decide matters of inclusion in previously sex-separated spaces, protection under previously sex-separated provisions, and legal questions relating to trans rights, women's rights, and LGBT rights. We're told that it's very important to respect people's gender identities, and we are encouraged and in some cases even compelled to make adjustments to our language and to the social world in order to accommodate gender identities. So the natural question arises, what exactly is a gender identity? And does a good account of gender identity make gender identity important? Important enough to replace or displace sex and/or gender? In this lecture, we'll consider 3 different accounts and we'll end with some skeptical considerations. Now, in philosophy these days, we are trying quite hard not to give lectures that cover the ideas of white men only, but alas, that is what we'll be doing here. If it's any consolation though, the white men all have women's names. Account number 1, making sense of our experiences. A paper from 2023 in the journal Mind by the trans legal theorist Florence defends an account of gender identity whose 2 crucial ingredients are gender subjectivity and gender identity, the latter being built out of the former. Gender subjectivity is just what it sounds like, a person's subjective experiences relating to gender. As Ashley puts it, I have coined the notion of gender subjectivity to refer in rough terms to the sum of individuals' gendered experiences of themselves. Gender identity is simple self-categorization as a man, woman, non-binary person, and so on. To put the idea simply, we each have a range of experiences that we interpret as gendered, and we make sense of these by coming to a conclusion about which gender category we belong in. More generally, Ashley says that as we navigate a hostile world, we encounter regimes of gender that impose themselves onto us, casting a gendered lens on our affects, attitudes, behaviors, mannerisms, relationships, appearances, and bodies. Such experiences are what I call gendered experiences of oneself. Through these encounters, we can come to recognize aspects of ourselves as gendered from the outside. That is, we recognize that others view aspects of us as gendered and/or from the inside, as we internalize schemes of gendering and ascribe a gendered nature to aspects of ourselves. So there is recognition here of what the second wave feminists were pointing at, treatment from the outside, but there is also a further thing, experiences from the inside, which may, according to Ashley, pull in a different direction. Throughout the paper, various examples of gender experiences are mentioned. There's more on the slide than I'll note out loud, but I'll note the ones that I want to return to. Her toy and clothing preferences as a child, to feel some ways about the prospect of being grouped with men, to experience gender norms as applied or applicable to oneself, to relish one's sexiness and apprehend it as gendered, to perceive one's mind as feminine, to wish one were or were not treated as or like a woman, to wish one was born in a different body. Now, if Ashley had said that these experiences determine gender identity, there would be obvious objections. Firstly, the neuroscience evidence does not support there being any such thing as a feminine mind, or more precisely, if there is such a thing, it is extremely rare, and most females don't have one. Secondly, a person with a physical disability may wish to have been born in a different body, and this has nothing to do with gender. Thirdly, all feminists experience gender norms as applied to themselves and wish they weren't. Similarly, to wish one were not treated as or like a woman because they wish they were treated, like men are, as human. Okay, but Ashley does not say that gender subjectivity determines gender identity. Rather, the idea is that each person uses their gender subjectivity as building blocks. And because building blocks can be assembled in all different ways, two persons with the same gender subjectivity may yet arrive at different gender identities. That is, they build different things with the blocks. There is a fact of the matter about what our gender-related experiences are, but it is the stance we take towards these experiences, how we interpret it, that defines who we are as gendered beings, as individuals with a gender identity. So where does this leave us? We have a clear account of gender identity. Gender identity is the self-categorization as man, woman, non-binary, etc., arrived at as a matter of making sense of one's subjective gender experiences. People have different experiences and different personalities, so they arrive at different gender identities. Two people with the exact same experiences, for example, young effeminate boys who grow up to be gay, could have different gender identities, and two people with the exact same gender identities, for example, both self-categorize as woman, could have had entirely different experiences. For example, one is responding to the fact of her pregnant female body, and the other relishes his sexiness in female typical clothing. Is gender identity important on this account? Ashley says it is a core element of the self, that requesting the pronouns that correspond to one's gender identity is a way of communicating what it means to respect you, and that feeling misperceived may sting, all of which may be taken as indirect claims that it is important. In direct answer to the question of its importance, Ashley says, gender identity matters because we craft it from a substrate that matters to us. Gender identity matters, inter alia, because we experience distress at being misgendered, because we feel like we belong with some rather than others, because we feel strongly about how we are treated due to how our gender is perceived. It matters because our experiences matter to us. It matters because we feel strongly about it. Two lines of objection are possible here. One comes from Thomas Bogardus and Alex Byrne, writing in the Journal of Controversial Ideas last year. They focus on the fact that Ashley appears to present gender identity as knowledge. That is, they say that the best way to make sense of Ashley's account of gender identity is to see gender identity as a belief that one has about the category that one belongs to. To have a gender identity of man is to have the belief that one is a man. But once we put things that way, it becomes puzzling why some things are left off the list of examples of gender experiences that Ashley offers. Why not also those things that presuppose belief, like feeling or being satisfied that one is a man, or wishing that one were not a man? But if we put those things on the list too, it would become much less clear that gender subjectivity explains gender identity. For to feel satisfied that one is a man is to know that one is a man. And that is the thing that explains the experience, not the other way around. They say that the fact that this class of experiences has been left off the list should raise a suspicion about the whole approach. Another shortcoming of Ashley's approach, Bogardus and Burns say, is that it cannot explain striking patterns. For instance, that adult females almost always believe that they are women, and adult males almost always believe that they are men. And it would struggle to make sense of the fact that children from around age 2 can correctly label girls and boys, including themselves, which is far too young to have compiled a range of gender experiences and synthesized them into a gender identity, and much more likely a result of tracking superficial indications of sex. Ashley's account also cannot account for someone being wrong about his or her gender identity, and yet that is intuitively possible given that humans are fallible and a process of reasoning is required to get from gender subjectivity to gender identity. Perhaps, Bogardus and Burns suggest, gender identity is not a belief and therefore not self-knowledge after all. Perhaps it is mere expression, like writing something in a decorative way. They say, his act may be pleasing or whimsical or rebellious, but it does not express any proposition. That rescues gender identity from the possibility of being false or mistaken. Just as you can decorate what you write however you like, you can declare whatever gender identity you like as a consequence, in some very loose sense, of your gendered experiences. But by the same token, it makes little sense to think of it as true. If your gender identity is man, but it's also not true that you're a man, the claim that you're a man seems rather undercut. Bogaerts and Byrne focus their critique on whether gender identity is a belief, and so whether it can be true or false. But another line of objection would be simply to ask directly, how important is this thing that Ashley has proposed, whether it's a belief or not? Returning to the distinctions we started with, we now have 3 to compare: sex, gender, and gender identity on Ashley's account. Consider a specific individual who is male in terms of sex, who has been subject to socialization into masculinity on the basis of his maleness, whether successfully or not, that is his gender, and who self-categorizes as woman, that is his gender identity, on the basis of a particular set of gender experiences, including relishing his sexiness in female typical clothing. Now we can ask a clear question: which, if any, of these 3 things deserve legal recognition or need a political movement? And which is the thing that previously sex-separated spaces, services, and provisions should be offered on the basis of? Is a women-only swimming evening at the local pool for females, that's sex or gender, or is it for people who self-categorize as women on the basis of the sense that they have made of their subjective gender experiences? And could it ever be relevant why a person has made the sense that they have of their gender experiences, or why they consider them as gendered in the first place? Ashley saying that gender identity is important because gender subjectivity is important to the person who has it is about as strong as saying that people's preferences are important because they are their preferences. That is true, but it doesn't tell us much about how important or what to do in conflict cases. Saying that gender identity is important because people feel distress or a sting when misperceived or mispronounced is about as strong as saying that casual sexism is bad for the same reasons. It is, but again, it would seem to matter whether the person doing it is being gratuitously hurtful or instead acting in pursuit of some valuable project of their own. If sex and/or gender are important, then showing that gender identity is important isn't enough to displace or trump them. We'd still have to work through whether and why gender identity should inherit all of the terms, legal protections, and social permissions previously attached to sex and/or gender. Ashley's may be a good account of gender identity, but it fails to make gender identity very important. It certainly doesn't offer any clear case for gender identity being more important than sex. Account number 2, identity and freedom. The economist Dierdre McCloskey, previously Donald, wrote a memoir called Crossing about his take on becoming a woman. Here are some things he says that we can extract the start of a view from. I did not change gender because I liked colourful clothing. Donald did not. Or womanly grace. Donald viewed it as sentimentality. The decision was not utilitarian. In our culture, the rhetoric of the very word decision suggests cost and benefit. My gender crossing was motivated by identity, not by a balance sheet of utility. Why then did Dierdre join the women's tribe? The question does not make sense, because it asks for a prudential answer when the matter is identity. Asking why a person changes gender is like asking why a person is a Midwesterner or thoughtful or great-souled. She just is. We make ourselves, which is our freedom as human beings. What's female? How do you know? Why wouldn't an earnest and harmless desire to act as one be enough? Why should the operation define it? Meaning here, sex reassignment surgery. The answer is not obvious, and since no financial fraud is involved, the government has no interest in stopping someone from claiming female gender. The question should be, why not? It's harmless. Ask the freedom question, why not? In slave societies, the answer is because it is my whim and wish as master that you do not. In free societies, there has to be more reason. Is anyone else's freedom curtailed by this act? You become a woman by being treated as one of the tribe. Nothing else is essential. And you treat yourself as one of the tribe too. Being Dutch is being homesick for Holland inside your head. Okay, so it is our freedom to make ourselves that gives identity this normative place, and perhaps also our tendencies from childhood that give what we choose to make of ourselves a certain ring of authenticity or importance. For McCloskey, a man can be a woman in the same way that a person can be Dutch or a Midwesterner. What's strange about this is that a person with an identity as Dutch or a Midwesterner will usually be from or live in Holland or the Midwest. So perhaps that's why he talks in terms of treatment, not aspiration. The book is a description of his route to passing as female and so being treated as a woman, suggesting that he doesn't think that identity as a mere psychological state would be sufficient. This would also give a justification to cross-sex hormones in that they facilitate passing and so help a trans person to get what they want, namely the treatment as a woman. McCloskey's view that gender crossing is a matter of identity and freedom might get men the freedom to wear women's clothes, attempt to pass as female, cultivate groups of women friends, and so on. But it's not clear that it would settle any of the law or policy questions. For example, who gets to compete in women's sports, or who must be included in lesbian events on pain of a discrimination claim. It could be true both that McCloskey has a freedom right to join the tribe of women and that lesbians have a freedom of association right to gather without McCloskey or any other male. Laura Valentini argues that there is a moral bad she terms transparency appraisal disempowerment. This might help us to fill in why McCloskey's form of making ourselves matters, and perhaps to get us closer to the law and policy questions. For if disempowerment is very bad, and exclusion of trans women from women-only spaces would cause it, then that would be a reason against exclusion. The transparency part means that we should be able to reveal aspects of our objective identities, the bundles of properties or attributes that we actually have, to others. The appraisal part means for their appraisal. So that, for example, if we are hilarious, then having revealed this, others appraise us positively for that reason. And the disempowerment part means that Valentini is particularly concerned with cases where some people acting non-deceptively and openly are nonetheless unable to reveal aspects of their objective identities to the public for appraisal. She writes that this kind of power is necessary for socially effective practical agency. We act and we are appraised. Other people praise, blame, admire, or disdain us, for example, and others' appraisals inform our self-respect. She writes, "What is the point, one might ask, in working hard and being kind to others and being a good citizen if all one gets in response is criticism and blame?" The most relevant form of disempowerment for us is structural disempowerment, which relates to background social scripts, for example, stereotypes about Black men, double binds for working mothers, and imprecise pejoratives that are hard to avoid. Her example is slut. So for example, a Black man is just going for a run in his neighborhood, but he's read as casing the joint for a robbery, for example. She mentions trans at this point in the paper, saying that if we don't have the category of trans, then those whose gender identities are not aligned with their biological sex lack the tools to convey their identity, including the appraisal aspects of it. If they openly showed themselves for the kinds of persons they are, they would likely fail. Their behavior would be routinely misinterpreted. And she gives an example of a trans woman denied driver's license renewal with the claim that they were misrepresenting their gender, when, as she says, they were just trying to show who they were. Katherine Jenkins, in her 2023 book, has a case of a trans woman going to a formal occasion and wearing a formal dress, so that if he were taken to be a man, then he would be assumed to be a violator of social norms and perhaps disruptive, attention-seeking, and so on. Whereas if he were taken to be a woman, then he would be assumed to be being a social norm conformer, respectful, appropriate, and so on. So if the trans woman's objective identity really does have the attributes of being conformist and respectful and appropriate, then he would be subject to transparency, appraisal, disempowerment if assumed to be being disruptive. Now to objections. First of all, is woman really an attribute or trait of a person that's in an objective identity bundle for public appraisal? Standard attributes that we would praise or blame or admire or disdain would be things like being funny, smart, kind, generous, earnest, simple, cruel, miserly. People who are women or who are Black have some of these attributes and have an interest in revealing them for appraisal. Woman just looks like the wrong kind of attribute to belong to this story. Perhaps what we should say instead is that there are traits that are appraised differently because of sexism, and a trans woman can have one such trait and want to be considered a good woman rather than a bad man. But then it looks rather more complicated. For example, wouldn't there be many women who want to be seen as dedicated workers rather than bad mothers? This was Valentini's double bind for working mothers. And isn't it a bit odd that satisfying the trans woman's appraisal desires depends on failing to satisfy women's? There are many more women than trans women, after all. And this is just another way of stating the tension with feminism. Why doesn't a man who wants not to be considered a bad man instead join the feminist fight against appraisal according to sex/gender? Even if we set aside that woman looks to be quite different to smart, funny, kind, Valentini merely wants accurate appraisal. Nothing in her view determines that cross-sex/gender identification must be positively appraised. It seems compatible with her view that different publics could appraise actions differently, as happens all the time given differing religious, political, and moral views. For example, radical feminists negatively appraising a trans woman's identification as wrongfully appropriating the concept woman, and liberal feminists positively appraising it, perhaps as disruptive to the gender binary or hegemonic gender categories. And perhaps one can acknowledge a trans woman's intentions are benign, while yet thinking the effects of his act are not. For example, he just wants to be among women, and that's fine, that's a positive or neutral appraisal, but he also inserts himself where he is not wanted and undermines the goods that the particular space was meant to serve. That's a negative appraisal. So even if we accepted Valentini's general thought that transparency, appraisal, disempowerment is bad, that wouldn't seem to entail that the trans woman is subject to this kind of disempowerment whenever he is not appraised as a woman would be. And so this doesn't seem to give us any justification for thinking the gender identity concept is more important than the sex concept. McCloskey may be right that freedom and identity give some justification to permit what he calls crossing, but he does not think enough about women's freedom, for example, to associate without men, crosses or not. And he does not think enough about everyone's freedom to tolerate but not endorse other people's freedom or identity projects, which they might find weird, offensive, distasteful, narcissistic, and so on. And McCloskey simply asserts that he's not harming anyone, which is particularly weird given that he also fully acknowledges the problem that men can be for women. Here's a noteworthy passage. Women who read a crossdresser are not violent, but frightened and indignant. Who is this guy? What's he up to? Dierdre knew from being a woman on trains late at night in Holland, or walking by Dutch cafes in the summertime, or living later in the less demonstrative but more dangerous environment of America, that women have daily experiences of men in fact being up to something, often something sexual, often enough something dangerous. At first, it was flattering, the knock on windows of the cafe as she went by, the propositions to come into the jazz club and have a drink. Then it was tedious or frightening. Women experience dangerous men all day long and are on the alert. The alertness is not male bashing, merely prudence in the company of people with greater upper body strength and the inclination to use it, intoxicated by lethal fantasies of what she really wants. Women who read a gender crosser are putting her in this category of dangerous men. To be read by a woman is utterly demoralizing. After all, the gender crosser is trying to join the woman, to pass as one, and instead they are treating her like a man. Maybe nuts, probably dangerous, definitely another one of those bloody men. McCloskey wants crossers to be treated by women as an exception to what they know about men, even though women themselves have no way of knowing who the good and bad men are, and there is no evidence to suggest that crossers are more likely good men than bad men. And the sexual aspect of the crossing, which McCloskey early in the book admits and details, then later in the book denies, is surely relevant to women's assessment of whether such men really are harmless. Account number 3, a sense of what does or doesn't fit. This third account comes from Rach Koska-Rowland and appears to be motivated by the observation that when trans people talk about their gender identities, they often talk about what fits. Koska-Rowland is one of the most recent papers published on gender identity and claims to offer a new account that avoids the problems of existing accounts. He proposes that our gender identity is to take it to be fitting or not take it to be unfitting for others to treat us as a woman, a man, as genderqueer, or as another gender. For example, a biological male might have a gender identity as woman because he takes it as unfitting for others to treat him as a man, or because he takes it as fitting for others to treat him as a woman. Koska-Rowland claims that because this account of gender identity involves normative experiences, it can vindicate the idea that gender identities merit respect. He says there is a consensus in moral and political philosophy that normative experiences like these merit respect. Koska-Rowland's talk of fit is borrowed from elsewhere in philosophy and applied onto gender identity. Philosophers who think about attitudes talk in terms of fit. For example, it is fitting to desire what is desirable and unfitting to envy what is not enviable. To say that something is fitting, then, is to say something like that it is appropriate or correct. So suppose a particular man, perhaps Koska-Rowland himself, takes it to be fitting for others to treat him as a woman. He gives some examples of what such treatment might consist in: using she/her pronouns for him, inviting him to women-only events, permitting him to use women-only spaces, and generally grouping him together with the women whenever there is grouping going on. He writes, "To have a sense that it is fitting to treat one as a woman involves having an intuition or making a judgment it is fitting to categorize one as a woman." You might have noticed that the account contained not only take it to be fitting, but also not take it to be unfitting. That was to catch people who aren't trans. Koska-Rowland writes that cis women don't take the category woman to not fit them. Cis women are treated as women and don't take it to be unfitting for them to be categorized as and conceived of as women rather than as men or as neither women nor men. Why does gender identity understood in this way merit respect? Koska-Rowland says it's because gender identities involve normative experiences. If I have the experience that it is unfitting for me to be treated as a woman, then I have the experience that there are strong normative reasons for others not to treat me as a woman, and that, other things equal, others ought not treat me as a woman, and that I ought not treat myself as a woman, for instance, by using women-only spaces and categorizing myself as a woman. He makes a comparison to religious minorities' beliefs about not working on holy days or wearing a turban, or every citizen's right to not have the state force a religion on them. And he simply says that gender identity is similar. He briefly entertains the possibility that there are judgments of fitting treatment that are outweighed by other considerations, like an aristocrat judging that it is fitting that others behave obsequiously toward him. But Koska-Roland asserts that gender identity is not like this. By treating such a person as an aristocrat, we are reinforcing a pernicious hierarchy. But by implication, when we treat a man as a woman because he judges that fitting, we are not. That is the whole argument. The man judges it fitting that he be treated as a woman. We should respect people's judgments about how they want to live unless they're in some way pernicious, like the aristocrat. Gender identity merits respect. The most obvious objection to this account is the same as to McCloskey's. If we should not treat people as women or men, so for McCloskey, joined together with Valentini's story, we should not appraise them qua woman or man, then it cannot be fitting to treat people as women or men, regardless of that being important to the person who desires the treatment. Another objection is to the attempt to make the view apply to non-trans people. The most obvious explanation for why women do not find it unfitting to be categorized as women is that by woman, they mean adult human female. And they are female, so it is fitting. The same does not apply to trans women, and the trans woman does not make himself a woman by using the same words to mean different things. Finally, even if some tiny normative weight goes to the idea that people's decisions about how they should live deserve respect, the same moral questions arise for McCloskey and Ashley as to women-only spaces. It is not only the trans woman who gets to decide how to live, or who has freedom of association, or who has projects to pursue, including the project of feminism. Once we think about other people's interests at all, the question of trans women's treatment as women or as female becomes far from obvious. Koska-Roland, like McCloskey, and perhaps unlike Ashley, given the Byrne-Bogartis criticism, may have established that gender identity has some minor normative importance. But that is nowhere enough to show that it trumps sex or gender, in the sense of gender norms imposed on the basis of sex, when it comes to social categorization. Some skeptical thoughts to end on. In her paper, Feminism Without Gender Identity from 2023, Anke Geuss argues that there is no account of gender identity that can do what trans activists want it to do, and that we should therefore proceed in doing feminism without it. This might sound gender critical, but let me explain why it is not, or at least not quite. She takes the project of feminism to be the abolition of gender norms, and because gender norms, which she articulates as unjustified expectations based on sex, are bad for trans people as well as being bad for women and to a lesser extent men, the project of feminism remains trans-inclusive. Indeed, she even goes so far as to say that gender norms are especially wrongful to trans people, although she offers no reasons for thinking this is true. A man who doesn't want to be treated as a man is not obviously more wronged than a woman who doesn't want to be treated as a woman, given that there is not just difference between gender constructions, but there is also hierarchy, and Geuss acknowledges that. So it is less a form of gender-critical feminism, which agrees about the abolition of gender norms, but focuses more narrowly on female people and the norms of femininity imposed on them, and more a form of liberal feminism, which sees gender norms as bad for everybody, and so feminism as a project for everybody. What is helpful about her skeptical argument as to gender identity is that she names a set of criteria that an adequate account of gender identity should meet. And then she works through 6 accounts to show that they don't meet the criteria, and suggests that it is unlikely that any will. Here are the criteria, and she notes that the second and third of these are the weakest. First, the term, and just as a side note, she uses the words concept and term interchangeably. The term should vindicate the trans as well as non-trans people's identification of their own gender identities. Second, and related, the concept must be such that it allows for privileged access to one's gender identity. Third, many assume that we all have a gender identity, although failure to meet this criterion shouldn't speak strongly against a particular concept. Fourth, The concept of gender identity at work in trans debates should sit well with two closely related but distinct claims of trans activists: that denying a person's gender identity or misgendering is a grave harm, and that we have a right to be treated and perhaps also seen as belonging to the gender with which we identify. Hence, the concept of gender identity should be such that people have, on non-instrumental grounds, a claim against others to respect their gender identifications. Finally, in order to make sense of trans people's claim to have their gender identities publicly recognized, and in order for appeals to gender identity to play a role in settling practical debates about rules regulating access to public spaces, it must sometimes be permissible for various institutions and maybe other agents to require information about one's gender identity. Okay, while I won't go through them all here, she discusses 6 accounts of gender identity. 1, lack of conformity with behavior and dispositions typical of one's sex. 2, discomfort with one's sex body. 3, assigned gender role. 4, aspirational gender role. This is closest to McCloskey's. 5, internalized gender norms. And 6, endorsed gender norms, which is probably closest to both Ashley's and Koska-Rowland's views. Grace herself thinks that the 5th proposal is a particularly good candidate, but this is Catherine Jenkins's account, which she has more recently admitted cannot do much normative work. The strongest accounts, in my view, are 2 and 4, discomfort with one's sexed body, and aspirational gender role. Kathleen Stock in Material Girls defends a version of 4, aspirational gender role, as the best understanding of gender identity. 2, discomfort with one's sexed body, can only account for transsexuals, so it does not meet the criteria above. But, as Goyce notes, it avoids a feminist objection. Since it does not rely on gender norms, it avoids the risk of perpetuating them. None of these 6 accounts meet all the criteria. 1 fails all of them, 2 fails the first and last, and further faces the conceptual shortcoming that it would be better taken as an account of sex identity rather than gender identity. 3 fails the 3rd, 4th, and 5th criterion, 5 fails the 4th and 5th criteria, the normative criteria, and finally 6 fails the 3rd, 4th, and 5th criteria, the 4th and 5th for the same reasons that 4 and 5 failed them. The failures of the normative criteria speak directly to our question of whether gender identity is important, and if it is, whether it is important enough to replace or displace sex and/or gender. Of course, it remains possible that some perfect account of gender identity waits just around the next corner, but if the criteria are fair, then we can conclude until then that a strong account that meets the criteria is not currently available. And given that the best available accounts, according to Goyce and according to me, fail the normative criteria, we are left with no reason to think gender identity particularly important.